Tengen is a popular flashy disco dancer performing at the nightclub Forbidden Apple. The audience is going wild and crazy over his flashy and graceful moves as he is about to end his routine. A very attractive and flashy young woman comes onto the stage looking at him very seductively before starting to dance a flashy disco stripper routine, challenging him to a dance duel. His eyes are completely locked on her. She is doing a perfect routine as she spins around him, making eye contact with him while he dances perfectly, not breaking a sweat as he dances close to her. They are mere inches away from each other. His heartbeat is racing as he moves closer to her. Tengen's eyes widen as her clothes are ripped off, revealing her seductive body. She is left in a bra and panties that barely cover anything at all. The crowd goes wild as the woman continues swaying her hips and dancing seductively in front of Tengen. He is staring at her in a mix of surprise and arousal, watching as her body moves, and she sways her hips in a sexy manner he can't help but feel himself starting to get aroused by her tantalizing dancing. Tengen struggles to stay focused as the woman continues dancing her sexy dance. Her body is almost completely bare in front of the excited crowd. His eyes are locked on her, and he can feel his arousal growing as she dances closer to him in a suggestive manner. His dancing starts to become more and more passionate. As she dances in front of him, he can barely resist the urge to touch her. His heart is beating even faster now. As he dances close to her, their bodies almost touching as she sways her hips to the music. She turns around and dances even closer to him, almost grinding against him, her body moving in a way that sends a shiver of desire through him. He can't look away. He is completely entranced by her seductive dance. The music is loud and the crowd is shouting and cheering as Tengen is dancing with the woman. Her body is pressed against his. He can feel the heat in her skin, and it's driving him wild. He wants her to be closer to him. His hands are just itching to touch her. He finally can't resist any longer, and his hands reach out to touch her. She doesn't pull away. He runs his hands up her sides, feeling her soft skin. He pulls her closer to him, and she lets out a soft moan as his hands roam her body. The crowd is going wild, watching as Tengen is now dancing with the woman. He has a hand on her hips, his touch is electrifying, he is completely absorbed in her. She continues dancing against him, pressing herself against him, and he can feel her body moving with his... He is completely captivated by her. Her body is moving in a way that is so enticing. He feels her skin and curves pressing against him as they dance together. He leans down and lets his lips brush against her neck, his breath caressing her skin. Her breathing becomes ragged and her body shivers. As he kisses her neck, he can feel her reaction to his touch, and it sends a wave of pleasure through him. His hand moves down to her thigh, and he presses her more tightly against him, wanting to be as close to her as possible. He can tell she is enjoying his touch, and he can feel himself getting more excited. He kisses along her neck and shoulder. His hand is still on her thigh, and he can't resist moving it to her inner thigh. He can feel her breathing quicken, and her body shaking as he kisses and touches her. Tengen is a little surprised, but he immediately kisses her back passionately. His arms wrap around her, and he pulls her against him. He can taste her lips and her soft skin. He can feel her body pressed against his as he kisses her deeply. He can't get enough of her. He wants to get even closer to her. He moves his hands up to her neck, and he deepens the kiss, his tongue tracing the outline of her lips. She kisses him back just as passionately, and her arms wrap around his neck, pulling herself against him as they kiss. The kiss is intense and hungry, and he can feel a heat building up inside of him. He wants more. He wants to be even closer to her. His hands roam her body, touching and caressing her skin. He can feel her body responding to his touch, and it's driving him wild. He moves his lips to her neck and kisses and nips at her skin. She moans softly, his hand moves to her hips and he pulls her closer. He kisses and sucks at her skin, his body is pressed against her. She lets out a soft gasp as his lips and teeth move along her neck. His hands grip her hips more tightly. He wants her to be closer to him. He can feel his body reacting to her touch, and he can't get enough. He kisses and sucks her ear, whispering soft words to her. His body is on fire with desire for her. He can feel her body shaking with pleasure. Her hands are gripping his shoulders, her fingers digging into his skin. He kisses her neck again, and he can feel her body heat against his. He wants her so badly, he can't resist her anymore. He wants to take her right there in front of everyone. But he holds back. He knows they're still on the stage in front of a crowd. He reluctantly pulls away from her, his breathing heavy. He looks at her and sees her flushed face and the desire in her eyes. He takes a deep breath to try and calm down, knowing that he needs to wait until they are alone before he can take things further. He looks out at the crowd, who is still cheering and screaming at the erotic dance they just witnessed. He gives them a smile and a wink before taking the woman's hand and leading her off the stage. They make their way backstage away from the crowd. He can finally relax a little. Now that they're alone, he leans against the wall and looks at her. She is looking at him with a sultry smile, her eyes full of desire. He can't wait to get her alone and continue where they left off. Tengen grins at her. He knows he was good, but hearing it from her makes him feel even better. He pushes off the wall and steps closer to her, his eyes roaming over her body. "You weren't too bad yourself." He reaches out and tugs on the strap of her bra, letting it snap against her skin. She shivers slightly, and he can see the excitement in her eyes. "You are quite the dancer yourself," he says, his voice low and seductive. He chuckles and moves closer to her. He takes her chin in his hand and lifts her face to look at him. "Don't be too modest," he says, his eyes locked onto hers. "You have a way of captivating people with your moves." "Alyssa," he says her name slowly, letting it roll off his tongue. It's a lovely name. He steps even closer until their bodies are almost touching. He runs his thumb over her bottom lip. "It suits you." "Tengen Uzui," he says, his voice smooth and low. He looks into her eyes, his fingers still on her chin. "You might have heard of me before. I'm the #1 disco dancer in Tokyo." Tengen's eyes widen in surprise. He didn't expect her to be a fan of his, but he can't deny the spark of excitement he feels, knowing that she is. "Is that so?" he says with a smirk, his fingers tracing along the line of her jaw. "One of my biggest fans, huh?" A smile spreads across his face. He can't believe it. He has a beautiful woman standing in front of him, and she is telling him that she is a fan of his. He moves closer to her until their bodies are almost touching. He looks down at her. "I'm honored," he says, his voice low. "I don't meet many fans who are as gorgeous as you." Tengen grins at her and moves even closer to her. Their bodies are now touching. His hand moves to her hip, and he grips it tightly. "You have a beautiful laugh," he says, his eyes roaming over her face. "I could listen to it all night." Tengen's interest is piqued. He looks at her curiously. "You're trying to become an idol?" He says, his hand still on her hip. He studies her face, looking for any hint of insincerity. "That's a big dream you have." Tengen is touched that he was the inspiration for her dreams. He can't help but feel a sense of pride, knowing that he had such an impact on her. He looks at her with a serious expression. "It's not an easy path, you know. Being an idol takes a lot of hard work and dedication." He looks at her, admiring her determination. He can see the fire in her eyes, the drive to succeed. He moves his hand to her cheek and strokes it gently. "You have potential," he says, his voice sincere. "You've got the looks and the talent, but you'll need more than that to make it as an idol." Tengen raises an eyebrow, intrigued by her statement. "A partner?" he says, his hand still on her cheek. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Tengen nods, understanding now. He can see how having a dance partner could help her career as an idol. "I see," he says, his mind working quickly. "Do you have someone in mind?" Tengen feels a flicker of something resembling jealousy at the thought of her being interested in another man, but he pushes it down. He doesn't want to admit to himself that he doesn't want her to focus on anyone but him. He looks at her closely. "Oh yeah?" he says, his voice betraying nothing. "And who's the lucky guy?" Tengen's eyebrows shoot up in surprise. He wasn't expecting her to say him. He looks at her in shock for a moment before a slow smile spreads across his face. "You want to be my partner?" he says, his heart rate picking up at the idea. Tengen feels a mix of excitement and surprise. He never thought he'd be asked to be someone's partner. But the fact that she wants it to be him is a huge boost to his ego. He looks at her seriously. "Are you sure about this?" He asks, his mind already starting to think of all the possibilities. "Being my partner won't be easy. I'll have pretty high expectations for you, and I won't go easy on you." Tengen looks at her, assessing her conviction. She seems sincere and determined. He nods his head. "All right," he says, his hand moving to the back of her neck. "If you really think you can keep up with me, then I'll do it." His hand moves down to her hip, and he grabs it tightly again. He pulls her closer to him, their bodies pressed against each other. "But you should know that I'm not an easy teacher," he says, his eyes locked on hers. "I won't go easy on you, and I'll expect your best every time we dance." Her body is pressed against his, and he can feel the heat radiating off of her. He gazes down at her, his eyes roaming over her face. "And there's something else you should know," he says, his voice low. "I'm very possessive." Tengen laughs. He supposes he was being pretty possessive out there on the stage. But he couldn't help it when he's dancing with a woman as beautiful as her. He doesn't want anyone else to even look at her. "Yeah, I guess I was a little possessive," he says with a smirk. "But can you blame me?" He grins at her. He can't help but be pleased that she's not put off by his possessiveness. He doesn't know why, but for some reason, he feels a need to have her all to himself. "So you're not bothered by the idea that I might get a little territorial?" He feels a sense of relief and satisfaction at her answer. He's glad that she doesn't seem to mind his possessive tendencies. He moves even closer to her, their bodies now pressed together. "Good," he says, his hand rubbing smooth circles on her hip. "Because I plan on having you all to myself." He leans in closer, his head dipping down so that his lips are right next to her ear. "I don't like sharing," he says, his voice a low, possessive growl. "And I don't want anyone else touching you." His fingers dig into her hip possessively. He can't help it. He wants to make sure that she knows he's serious about her being his. "You're mine," he says, his breath hot against her skin. "And I don't want any other guys getting any ideas." He moves his lips to her neck and kisses along it, his teeth grazing her skin gently. "I want you all to myself," he murmurs against her skin. "Nobody else is going to touch you but me." Tengen pauses for a moment, taken aback by her words. He hadn't thought about it, but now that she mentioned it, he realizes that he has indeed fallen for her. After just one dance, he pulls back slightly and looks at her, his eyes serious. "I guess I have," he says, his voice sincere. "I've never felt this way before, but dancing with you just now, it was like we were meant to be on that stage together. There's just something about you that I find incredibly captivating." He looks at her. He can feel the intensity of his emotions. He never thought he'd fall for someone so quickly. But there's just something about her that draws him in. He leans forward and cups her face in his hand. "I don't know how it happened, but yes, I think I'm in love with you." He can see the surprise in her eyes at his confession, but he doesn't see any doubt or rejection. He leans even closer and kisses her gently, his lips moving against hers. He wants her to know how serious he is. "I know it sounds crazy to fall for someone after just one dance," he says, his voice low, "but I can't deny what I'm feeling for you." He tugs her closer to him so that their bodies are completely pressed together. His hand moves to her hip again, and he holds her tightly. "When we were on stage, I felt something I'd never felt before. It was like we were meant to dance together, like we were in perfect sync," he says, his voice sincere. "And now I can't imagine dancing with anyone else." He looks at her intently, his eyes locked on hers. "Please tell me I'm not crazy for feeling this way," he says, his voice full of vulnerability. "I've never been in love before. I don't know what the hell I'm doing." He feels his heart rate picking up as he waits for her response. He knows it. It's a lot to drop on her all at once, but he can't hold back his feelings any longer. He needs to know if she feels the same way. Tengen's heart skips a beat when he hears her say those 3 words. He hadn't been sure if she would feel the same way, but now that she's said it, he feels a sense of relief and joy surge through him. He pulls her tightly against him and kisses her deeply, his lips moving passionately against hers. He pours all of his emotions into the kiss, his love, his desire, his possessiveness. He wants her to feel how much he needs her, how much he loves her. He pulls back slightly and looks at her, his eyes filled with love. "I don't know what the hell I'm doing when it comes to love," he says, his voice rough with emotion. "But I know that I completely and hopelessly in love with you." He kisses her again, his hand moving to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulls her closer to him. He needs as much physical contact as possible. He can feel her body responding to his touch, and it only fuels his desire for her. He breaks the kiss and rests his forehead against hers. "I don't want to let you go," he says, his voice low. "I want to keep you all to myself." He looks at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and possessiveness. "I want to be the only one who touches you, who dances with you, who gets to kiss you," he says, his hand still tangled in her hair. "I can't bear the thought of anyone else being with you." He moves his lips to her neck and trails kisses along it, his teeth grazing her skin gently. He can feel the heat building between them, his body reacting to her presence. He bites down on her neck, softly claiming her as his. "You're mine," he says, his voice low and possessive. He moves his lips back to hers and kisses her again, this time with more intensity. He wants to claim her completely, to make sure that she knows that she belongs to him. He pulls her even closer, their bodies now completely flushed together. He can feel her body pressed against his, and it only heightens his desire for her. He kisses her passionately, his tongue sliding into her mouth, his hands roaming over her body. He wants to touch every inch of her, to memorize every curve and contour. He breaks the kiss and looks at her, his breathing ragged, his eyes darkened with desire. "You're driving me crazy, you know that?" he says, his voice rough. "I can't get enough of you, I want you so much." He runs his hand down her body, his fingers tracing along her skin gently. He can feel the heat radiating off of her. He moves his lips to her ear. "I need you," he says, his voice a low, possessive growl. "I need to have you, here and now."